A Beechcraft Baron is on final approach into Kerrville, Texas. 6 people on board, a coach, an architect, a ballet patron, a church member, and a pilot who'd flown thousands of hours. Just minutes away from landing, both engines suddenly quit. Witnesses on the ground saw the plane bank right, flip upside down, and slam into a ravine. The shocking part? This crash didn't happen because of a storm or a mechanical defect. It happened because of one simple pattern of routine shortcuts. And some new discoveries show just how preventable it really was. On April 22, 2019, 65-year-old Jeffrey Weiss loaded 5 passengers onto his 1999 Beechcraft Baron 58 for what should have been just a quick business hop from Houston to Kerrville. This wasn't a random group of strangers. These were trusted friends and clients. Stuart and Angela Kensinger, both well known in Houston. Angela was a lacrosse coach at St. John's School. Mark Ciano, connected to the Houston ballet community. Scott Miller, a church leader known for his kindness, and Mark Tellepson, part of a respected Houston family in construction. This wasn't some risky adventure. They were headed out to look at property. Just an hour-long flight, nothing unusual. And Jeff? He wasn't some weekend novice. He had over 5,600 hours of flight time, with more than 2,400 hours in this exact airplane. He also had an ATP rating and was known for volunteer flying, helping veterans, doing angel flight missions. To his community, he looked like the definition of a safe, experienced pilot. But here's where the real problem begins. Jeff also had habits, and habits in aviation can be extremely dangerous when they turn into shortcuts. He was known to do quick walk-arounds instead of detailed pre-flights. He often trusted his handwritten fuel logs and engine monitor data more than actually sticking his eyes on the tanks. And in a Baron, with its quirky fuel system, that's a risky way to operate. This crash is the perfect example of how even the most experienced pilots can fall victim to their own routines. The Beech Baron's fuel system is tricky. The gauges don't drop from full until you're already below 75 gallons. The little sight gauges on the wing, they only show the fuel level between 40 and 60 gallons. Nothing above, nothing below. So if you're outside that range, you're basically guessing unless you physically verify the tanks. Now, here's the crazy part. Just 8 days before this crash, Jeff called in a fuel order by phone. He wasn't even there to supervise. His log showed the tanks topped at 194 gallons. But the fuel receipts proved that was wrong. In reality, he only had about 173 to 182 gallons. That's a 12 to 21 gallon error that carried forward into every single log entry for the next 6 flights, including this final one. And because the airplane's fuel transmitters were faulty, both gauges in the cockpit showed about 5 gallons more than what was really in the tanks. So his bad math actually lined up with what the cockpit instruments were telling him. It looked right, but it wasn't. And here's the real kicker. For this IFR trip, by law, he needed 67 gallons of usable fuel. Enough for the destination, an alternate, and 45 minutes of reserve. Jeff's own log shows he had 50 or maybe 54 gallons when he left Houston. The truth? Based on engine monitor data, it was actually closer to 38 gallons. He was way under the legal requirement. Why would he do that? Well, this is where the weight and balance issue comes in. With 6 adults on board, the plane was already over its maximum gross weight. If he added more fuel, he'd only make that worse. So, instead of removing passengers or saying no to the flight, it looks like he quietly chose to carry less fuel. And honestly, that's the really frustrating part. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of a pattern. Call in fuel, don't supervise, trust the gauges, trust the logs, and assume it'll all work out, because it always has before. That routine worked right up until the very last minutes of this flight. When you break down the numbers, the Baron was loaded at 5,598 pounds, just shy of 100 pounds over the legal limit of 5,500. Doesn't sound like much, right? Here's the real problem. The center of gravity was about an inch too far aft. And that's not just a paperwork violation. Even if the airplane had somehow taken off with zero fuel, the CG would still be out of limits. In other words, this airplane was fundamentally unbalanced before it even left Houston. Now, why does that matter? With the center of gravity pushed too far back, the airplane becomes less stable and far harder to recover from stalls or spins. And in a twin-engine aircraft like this, where asymmetric thrust is already a challenge, that little inch aft becomes a huge deal. It's the difference between having a fighting chance to recover and entering an unrecoverable spiral. And here's where I get frustrated, because this is the mindset a lot of pilots fall into. You hear it all the time. It's just a few pounds, just a few gallons. I've flown like this before, nothing's going to happen. And 99 times out of 100, maybe nothing does happen. But when you stack that on top of bad fuel math, faulty gauges, and low weather minimums, you're not just rolling dice. You're setting up a guaranteed failure when something finally breaks the chain. Weiss had a reputation as a generous, skilled, and trustworthy pilot. To his friends and passengers, he was safe. But that's exactly where overconfidence creeps in. When nothing bad has happened before, you start convincing yourself that nothing bad will happen. And that confidence, it can blind you to the fact that your margins are shrinking to nothing. By the time Jeff reached Kerrville, he was on the RNAV GPS 1-2 approach. Cloud bases were hanging between 600 and 1,200 feet, so he had maybe 800 feet above the ground to play with once he broke out. That's already tight. Then disaster struck. At about 3,900 feet MSL, the left engine quit. Just 10 seconds later, the right engine failed too. Imagine the panic. You're in the clouds, descending, and both engines go dark. To his credit, Jeff did manage to restart the left engine about 40 seconds later. But here's where the fatal mistakes came in. First, he never retracted the flaps. They stayed at 15 degrees, acting like an anchor. Second, he never feathered the right propeller. And a windmilling prop creates an insane amount of drag. Between the flaps and that dead prop, the airplane was bleeding speed fast. The Baron's minimum controllable airspeed, VMC, is 83 knots. Drop below that, and the rudder and ailerons don't have enough authority to counter the asymmetric thrust, and that's exactly what happened. The plane slowed below 83, lost stability, and witnesses on the ground saw it, low and struggling, then banking right, flipping upside down, and nosediving into the ravine. One described it as if the plane was just trying to stay up before it gave out. Here's the part that's really crazy. According to the NTSB's performance study, if Jeff had simply retracted the flaps and feathered the right prop, the Baron had enough power on the left engine to make the runway. And even if he didn't do either of those steps, just holding 100 knots of airspeed could have allowed a survivable forced landing in the fields ahead, but the discipline to stick to the emergency checklist wasn't there. And at the worst possible moment, the airplane crossed the line from controllable to unrecoverable. Now, some people point to Jeff's autopsy. He did have severe coronary artery disease, the kind that put him at real risk for a sudden cardiac event. But the data doesn't lie. He was alert. He was controlling the airplane right up until the speed bled off below VMC. This wasn't a heart attack. This wasn't incapacitation. This was decision-making, plain and simple. And here's the truth. The real root cause wasn't a single bad choice. It was a pattern. Skipping pre-flights, phoning in fuel orders, trusting logs over receipts, ignoring weight and balance, and then skipping checklist discipline in the emergency. That's what killed this flight. A pattern of shortcuts that felt routine, until they weren't. And we can't forget the victims. These weren't just anonymous names in a government report. They were a coach, a mentor, an artist, a family man, a trusted professional. They were people with communities who loved them, and those communities are still grieving today. The lesson for every pilot is this: hours and skill don't save lives. Discipline does. The checklist isn't just a piece of paper. Weight and balance aren't just numbers. Fuel planning isn't just a formality. These things exist because when the margin shrinks, they're the only guardrails keeping you alive. So here's my challenge to you. Was this crash really about complacency, about overconfidence, or about misplaced trust? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Because one thing is clear, this wasn't just bad luck. It was a routine that turned deadly.